You're listening to the Brenton On Tour Podcast.
That's right.
He travels the world running concerts and searches for the best coffee, people, and amazing stories so you don't have to.
Pay attention, you're going to learn something for a change.
This is a show about all of those things and much, much more.
You're blowing my mind right now. I hope someone's recording this.
So settle in, pour a cup of amazing coffee. He's a coffee snob, by the way. Crank that ghetto blaster and enjoy the 150,000 ranked podcast in the land.
Fake laugh, hiding real pain.
I think that's an exaggeration. It's the Brenton On Tour Podcast.
Any question?
Here's BD.
Hey everybody, what's happening? We are back to the Making It series. It is the Brenton On Tour Podcast for another week. You know, I have these in the can. I got I want to study on making it and people's version of making it and how they've defined it within themselves and if they're still searching for it. And everyone has their own definition, as we've covered in a few episodes already. So took a little break last week. Big thanks to my friend Dean Blundell for coming on, talking a little sober talk. We did some pretty serious interaction in numbers there. So it was really, really good and very happy that you guys reached out and sent me a lot of DMs. Just the first day alone, DMs I got about, hey, I'm struggling a bit, or, you know, I'm what do I do next? Very interesting. Everyone's got their own journey, as I've talked about in great length. So not going to talk about it too much more now. I'm going to leave it as it is, but thank you so much for listening last week and all your support and kind words. So back to making it now. And my guest this week, to me, has made it. I mean, the guy runs a giant podcast network. He's had a successful career in radio and one of the most go-to guys in this space. So this is kind of two parts today. There's making it, like, what was Matt's trajectory and did he make it in his eyes? And then actually I get a lot of questions about the podcast space. How do you make a podcast? And, you know, what do we do? And I have a simple breakdown for them, but Matt is a really great resource for people. He builds pods for a living very successfully. So two parts here, making it and how do you make a podcast? Might as well put them both together and have, you know, a little bit of fun with it. So welcome, Matt Cundill. How you doing, buddy? Welcome to the show.
That is an incredible intro. I love it.
Well, hey, sometimes I get it right.
And
every now and again, I get it right.
I don't even mean the description about me. I mean the description right off the top of the show and the music and the production.
What a guy.
I love it.
What a guy. Well, welcome to it, man. I mean, we've been talking for a few months. We're how do we say, partners on the Dean Blundell Network. We're associates on the Dean Blundell Network, who has given me such a great platform to yatter on about things that I think people might care about. And you've got your own amazing network of pods as well, called the Soundoff Network, which you guys can check out right here. If you're watching at home, you've got the Soundoff Podcast Network, and then there's the Soundoff Podcast, which Matt does. So my friend, thanks for making the time today and for all of your help thus far. How are you?
I'm doing really well. It's Winnipeg. It's like minus 30 something. And here we are inside in the winter. I kind of love this time of year just from the mere fact that I can sit inside and make podcasts all day.
How cold is it in Winnipeg right now?
Minus 30 something. I stopped checking at some point. I'm probably about minus 24. And then with the wind, you add that in, it gets in the minus 37 area.
That's crazy. And for, our American friends, that's just, I won't try to do the math for you, but it's really cold.
Yeah. If I could actually convert that over, and that would probably put it at about minus 10 or 12. Fahrenheit.
Right. It's basically throw water in the air and have it turn to,
I haven't done that this
evaporation.
year.
Evaporation.
It's a great social media piece when that happens.
Really is. It really is. So there's a couple of things that we're going to cover off here. Obviously, we talked about, which was your network and sort of your journey into radio and some things. So I think I want to start with that and give people a bit of Matt and sort of like your definition of some of these things that I'm trying to discuss, which will turn into giving some advice into how to start a podcast. Because I get asked a lot, how do you start a podcast, and all walks of life. People walking dogs, or my cousin's got he does one for like a fishing thing in Ontario, and they want to start one internally. So there's so many ways to go about it. Maybe we can cover some of that today, but let's do the Matt breakdown here. So let's give a little bit of history as to your career so far into radio first, and sort of how that became.
Born and raised in Montreal. The two best things about Montreal are the Montreal Canadiens and Chaume 97.7 FM. And I growing up, late 1980s, 86, the Canadiens win the Stanley Cup. 87, the airwaves are full of Bon Jovi and eventually Guns N' Roses and a whole bunch of other things. And I don't think I was going to be making the Canadiens, but I thought I might be able to get on the radio at Chaume. And in the years that ensued, I went to Acadia University, studied political science. And I think all throughout, when you're 18, that's when you really start to map out what's it going to take to really make it, and what's that path going to look like. And I said, well, I want to get a degree, but I also want to find my way into radio. And what would success be like? So I started to put little benchmarks in along the way. I said, if by this age I'm doing this particular shift in this particular market, I will have made it. Which is kind of crazy, because when you do get to that benchmark, you really have to start thinking about what's next. So, I think I probably would have been better off doing some longer term planning. But I did get on radio in the Annapolis Valley in Kentville, Nova Scotia. And it was,
Wow.
Listen, I was talking to cows all night long, or whoever was listening. There were people listening all night between 12 and 6. And most of them were, some had partied, but some were really up all night and doing things. And, it's quite a nice audience, and it's a great sort of playground to learn. As the years went by, 1992, I graduated, went to Montreal. I got to work all nights at Chaume, and Montreal all nights. There's no place like Montreal after 3 a.m. I know Toronto at the time had a 1 o'clock closing time. That was, that city had long shut down, but I think only Montreal and New York are the cities that truly run all night. And, but from there, again, doing all nights. So again, I had that goal, maybe this afternoon drive in a top 10 market, and got to do evenings in Edmonton at 100.3 The Bear, which is now, I guess, regarded as a legendary rock radio station in the country. It had just started at the time, and found myself doing evenings. Other people at the station, people like Jeff Woods, who a lot of people know as the voice of classic rock. And he was doing afternoons. And, as things progressed by the mid-90s, I was doing afternoon drive, and did that right through until 2002, moved back to Montreal to, I really wanted to become a program director of a radio station. I had 3 kids. They were all under 2 years old. I said, I'm not going to be able to do mornings. That's going to be a little crazy for me, and probably not a healthy lifestyle. So I chose being a program director, where, and I think being a program director really sort of led me into the podcast thing, and, how audio is assembled. How is it presented? How do we make it so that the most people are going to want to listen to it? And so, going back to Montreal as assistant program director at Chaume, and then later moved to Winnipeg in 2006 to be the program director at Power 97. Again, program director, top 10 market. That's good stuff right there. In 2014 was restructured out of that position. And that's kind of the direction I saw radio going. And this is where I think I'd made it in radio, and now I don't have radio. And I really kind of sensed I wasn't going back to radio. So this is kind of where you had to take stock and look around and say, okay, what's going to happen next? And honestly, I had no idea what was going to happen next. And I spent 2 years really trying to figure out what was going to be next. I did some radio consulting. I, still sort of kept up my voiceover business and being a voice actor. But honestly, there wasn't much to do in that period. It was radio
at that time is funny, because I didn't necessarily grow up with it per se. My grandpa had a radio show in Lindsay, Ontario, so I was always going down into the basement. You'd see the studio and the mic, and that might have been the first cue. My dad was a musician, and I would see him play and stuff. But that first cue of like a microphone and a little studio, it was cool. And that idea, radio then entered my life. My cousin actually ended up working at Edge 102 in Toronto, and that's where I met, Neil Morrison and Brother Bill and all that, George and all those guys. I had known all the guys prior to Dean Blundell getting there. Actually, I'd known all those kind of people, and it was fascinating to me that radio at that time, at least growing up for me, 80s, 90s, radio guys, the DJs were everything. Like, we went to you guys for everything, and this is even before the break of the net in 94, 95. Like, we went to you guys. It's only really, I think, in the last, to me, in my brain, like in the last maybe 5 years or 6 years, where radio, and with all due respect to radio, but it sort of has lost its luster a bit from the standpoint of, like, we still go to the radio guys for everything. I think in some of those like Lachlan's show, probably I would say would have that, Jeff O'Neill in Vancouver, but they have this audience where people look at them as their go-to and gods. But you guys have to move around a lot. You gotta, like, what'd you lay out, like 8 places that you've been to try to find your way, to try to find that way? Is that pretty common for radio coming through that time? It was like you're working towards getting the morning, or you're working towards afternoon drive. What are those goals for you guys at that stage?
I think you just move to the next spot, and the next spot may not be available in your market. So if you want to be doing mornings in Vancouver, you can count the number of great morning positions on just under 2 hands. But how many really successful ones are there? Well, I want to do it rock radio. Well, you can't, because Jeff O'Neill's been doing that for a very long time. He's done it very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe you want to go and to another market to do that. It's kind of where the job will sort of supersede the marketplace. But mobility is so important. It doesn't even, matter in radio. It could just be in any form of entertainment. And we look at Tom Brady. Well, Tom Brady got a little tired of Belichick and eventually said, I need receivers and a whole bunch of other stuff. I can go get that in Tampa Bay. So a little mobility is going to help. And if you're open to being mobile, and I'll give you an example. I thought at one point in that period from 2014 to 2016, I think I need to move to Los Angeles if I want to be a little bit more serious about voice acting, to go and get voice gigs. That's where the video games are made. That's where the cartoons are made. And that's really where, the planet was going. And I think between 2014, 2016, I was taking stock and go, wait. Audio is getting bigger. There's more of it being consumed. There's more of it being made. Why can I not find a good radio gig? And I thought that was the disconnect for me. Oh, okay. So what I need to do is I want to do audio. First thing I did was buy this microphone. Second thing I did was buy that board. And eventually, we got a light, and then we got another microphone in the corner, and we started to build out from that. So we know audio is being, we know that what Gretzky says, don't go to where the puck is, go to where you think the puck is going to be so you can score. So there was a lot of that going on in this period as, we're trying to discover what we want to do. And it was right around 2016 that I, went to the podcast movement in Chicago, which is a conference. It's still going on today in its early stages. But I went and I said, what's this? What's going on here? So everybody had a microphone and everyone's recording stuff, and people were kind of joyous and fun. And yeah, there were beanbags and there were a lot of hipsters and there was, a lot of millennials doing their thing. But I thought, okay, wait a second. This is familiar territory for me. I looked at it as pond hockey, that I can skate around this pond. I can keep the puck on my stick because I know what I'm doing with audio. I don't know where to score, but when I find the net, I'm going to take a shot and score. And so that really opened me up to the possibilities of what podcast is. And a few weeks later, the Soundoff Podcast was created.
I remember Todd Hancock was one of the first ones I knew that was into that space, and Neil and Danger all out here. Like, after the big Seafox purge happened back in whenever that was, they all kind of tried it. The history on the podcast side, you'd have to let everyone know. I mean, they've probably been around a long time in some form or another. They're called podcasts now, but we've all listened to audio books or some kind of thing for a long time. But what do you like this craziness of just everyone's got a pod, quote unquote? Here we are, some asshole that like me who drinks coffee and has a podcast now. You just kind of, everyone has one. Why is this surge so crazy? Is it an information like everyone just wants more and more and more, or is it just because of more platforms, or there's just more talent out there? It's unbelievable. There's so many podcasts, but in a good way. I mean,
yeah, you go back to 2004, the first podcasts were out there, and we're going to put it was basically hooking audio up to an RSS feed, and it really hasn't changed much to this day, because that's essentially what we do. A little bit later on, Apple got involved, and I want to say that Adam Curry, who was an MTV VJ at one point, he is regarded as the podfather, but this guy is just so technologically, has this vision. But I think it was Apple that really, their involvement was saying, hey, we're going to put this on iPods, and because we really think this is something interesting. And so, credit Steve Jobs to that. And that's why Apple today still has a lot of podcast listeners and is big in the ecosystem. 2015 Serial came out. A lot of people were quite, captivated by that. A lot of credit goes to public radio, NPR and CBC and BBC for getting into the space. And, it's a lot of talking and storytelling that goes on. So they're at the forefront of this stuff. So it's really been sort of an escalation of good things to get us here. There really hasn't been a big podcast hit created since Serial in 2015 that sort of brought people into listening to podcasting. 2016, I got into it, and I know Todd Hancock, you mentioned, got into it. He was my episode number 2 of my series, but I got to episode number 2. I listened back to it, and I said, we got to make the production a little bit better on this. And here's radio guys who are doing a podcast, and I think the goal for me was to go out and say, what does radio have to do with podcast, and vice versa? And it took a number of years to really figure out that they don't have a lot in common.
Well, I noticed like when you listen to sports radio or something, up probably 5 years ago, 6 years ago, they were, hey, check out the pod. Like they would just take the radio show and throw it up into an audio form that you could listen to while you drive. Which that is still pretty new to, I think, in the ecosystem, because I didn't hear about that. Like if you didn't listen in the afternoon, you missed the show. Now you can catch everything, almost everything that everyone does in media is put into podcast form in some way or another. And as you've pointed out and helped greatly on, there's plenty of opportunity for revenue, and there's plenty of opportunity for chances to make money in an unconventional way, really, in a new way to get your voice out and monetize it. And I'm amazed that more people actually don't, for the amount of pods that are out there. I'm amazed that there aren't more people doing it that are in media. There seems to be a reluctance to dive in still from some old school media people,
because it's hard. It's really, really hard. And I mentioned sort of the difference between radio and podcast is it's immense. So if I were to go into a radio studio and do a show, traffic and weather are all pretty much done for me. All the commercials are set. The music beds play. Music is all set. So over 60 minutes, I'm going to talk for what, 6-7 minutes, maybe more if it's a morning show.
Mm-hmm.
And then all the other stuff is taken care of it for me. It's all been taken care of for me. So now it's podcast. It's wide open. It's a blank canvas. I've got to go and get all the sounds necessary to keep a show moving forward.
Yeah.
It's going to not be listened to immediately. It's going to be on demand. What if somebody listens to the show 30 days from now? What if it's 60 days from now? Is it still going to be relevant? And how do I make that to be still relevant? So there's a lot that goes in. And listen, I'm not saying radio is easier or harder. The hardest job in media is to do a morning show like Jeff O'Neill does 5 days a week, 4 hours of live content. The second hardest job is to do a successful podcast.
It's funny you say that, because when you listen to Jeff's show or Locke's show, it seems like it's on autopilot. I know there's a lot of back end production, and possibly it has to do, and I don't listen to Locke's all the time because I'm on a different time zone. It's possibly due to the fact that the same 5 songs play every morning, and it's nothing more than that. I don't think I've heard a new song on a Jeff O'Neill show in months. And what I mean by that is just like, it's just like, oh, there's Harvey Danger. Oh, there's the New Radicals. Oh, there's AC/DC. It's like, someone play the new Moist record, please. That's great. Someone play some new Big Wreck. Someone play it. Just, I understand we're getting into the minutia. I don't want to dive too far into that, but they make it sound easy because they got the same bits every day and they have the same whatever. And I mean, this podcast land is a lot of work. So someone comes
to that,
yeah,
credit, podcasters should be learning from that, in that things are there at the same time every day, every week, and there's an expectation. So if you're doing a podcast, be predictable, that you know what you're going to get. Don't just do a podcast about widgets for 4 episodes, and then on the 5th one, you're going to move over and do something on bottled water. So stick with that. Also, consistent releases. Lachlan shows up at the same time every day for his show. Everybody knows it starts at 5:30 or 6 a.m. and it ends at a particular time. And at 8 o'clock, you're going to get this, and at 9 o'clock, you're going to get that. Those are expectations that are given to people with a listener. It's a rapport that is created. And why do podcasters fail? It's because they do different stuff and different things and go willy-nilly and think, oh, it's my show and I can do what I want. Well, you can, but don't expect the listeners to be there for that.
So to that point, radio keeps firing people. So out here, 1040 cleaned out their sports department, and then Sakaris and Price, who had a really, busy afternoon show, switched over to pods, and then Don Taylor and Rick Dollywell switched over to Check, kind of doing a show but also doing a pod. And at first, it was they were kind of rough, right? Because they're trying to find their way. They're not used to these bits. But then Sakaris and Price wisely brought all their bits in. And so to that programmed listener, that seems like the way to go. Like, you don't want to listen to Sakaris and Price, to your point, and have it be completely different. You want it to kind of be the same and familiar. But somebody like myself, for instance, that had to build this thing from the ground up, scratch up, no following, no anybody, no anything, really. You're clawing out one person at a time. I had one download. I'm like, whoa. And then I had 8, and then I had 40. And then it was like, great. You see progress as you go. So it's daunting. How do you tell somebody that says, hey, I walk dogs for a living and I want to start a podcast about dog walking or whatever, or I've got I've got a Star Wars podcast that only talks about the stormtroopers. What do I do? Whatever it is, there's no bad idea when it comes to a pod if you've got an audience. But how do you tell someone as simply as possible, start, and this is how you do it?
So the reason why a lot of people want to get in and do podcasts is because audio is very powerful. But what's really hard about it is creating great audio. So ask yourself before you start anything, what's in it for the listener? And it has to start and end with that. You can't start a podcast because you want to grow your dog walking business. You can't start a podcast because you think you're going to be, just famous and I'm going to just, build my brand and people will like me. You really do have to put something out there that's going to be for the listener. They're giving up their time to listen to this. They're going to be giving up space on their phone. And I think you need to be conscious of it. And it's, maybe you got like 3 episodes in mind, but what's episodes 4 through 10 look like? And what are you going to talk about? And how's the listener going to consume this? And how long is it going to take to put together? So there's all these factors you need to put in when it comes to starting a podcast. I think a lot of people underestimate how hard it is, not necessarily to put out a podcast, because anybody can just, you can sign up on Anchor for free, and you can maybe get on an easy plan with Libsyn and put out some audio, as it were. You can go testing, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, of course, you can go out there and do that. But what's really hard is creating a successful podcast. And
no kidding.
Going to be one that's going to be sustainable.
Kidding.
But plan it out. Like, listen, what's your release schedule? Is it every week? Because every week is a lot. Maybe
for me, I've seen gains. I'm very happy with the progress that the show is making. We talked a couple months ago, and you said, generally speaking, 3 years is that number where people decide whether they're going to stay or go. And so I guess that it leads to this kind of question about, why do people stop producing their show? And what's that level of success? It's to each their own. Like, when you ask the guests to come on, it's funny. When I ask a guest to come on, I often get them. Once the publicist gets involved, then it turns into numbers, this, and that. And it's like, sure, but I could tell you I have, 50,000 downloads. But if you're only going on shows that do 1 million or 250,000 per, like, it just kind of seems defeatist. So I'm happy with the progress, but it can certainly, mess with your brain a little bit if you're kind of stuck and you don't know where to go with it. know?
So you brought up a couple of things there. So when do people stop producing shows? And the first thing is they'll get to about episode 4 or 5, and then they'll go, I got to make a change. Maybe it's around 7. A lot of people just quit. There are hundreds of thousands of podcasts, many of them in Anchor, where you started for free and there was really no sort of investiture off the top, of podcasts with just one episode in them because people just tried it and then they walked away. Some people get to 17. I don't know why 17 is a number. They stop, right? They just go, that's it. I can't commit to this anymore. There's the people who go, oh, I don't see the ROI, which I find to be incredibly strange because, making money is not really, podcast is more about marketing. It's not as much about making money and selling ads. That stuff is nice and selling ads is hard, but only 9% of podcasts out there even have anything to do with an ad to begin with. So it's really from the marketing side, but a lot of people sort of demand the ROI. How you can demand ROI from a product that is on demand, that seems a little bit crazy too. A lot of people get to 50. They'll do 1 year of every week and they go, yeah, I'm done. I don't see the ROI, or I don't know why. Sometimes they'll get to that and get a reboot. We'll get somebody to help elevate their podcast to another level. And take it, maybe it signs on with a network, which works sometimes. Maybe it gets some form of injection. They get into dynamic ad insertion, which can be helpful. Could be anything. But again, it takes 3 years to build an audience, and nobody wants to ever really hear that. But it doesn't matter if you're launching a radio station. I mentioned the Bear early. It took 3 years for that station to become an established radio station in people's minds. 3 years for a morning show to launch. I think if you ask anybody who's done a radio show, it does take 3 years. And even the most famous of people who've come to me and said, I want to do a podcast. I'm like, okay, understand that a lot of people are going to come in early. Your first 4 episodes are going to do quite well. It's going to drop between episodes 5 and 10, and you're not to panic. What that is that's your audience who said, you know what, I love this person who's a celebrity. I just don't know if I want to hear them in audio form. I'm fine on Instagram or television or wherever you get them from. So then it goes down, but then it begins to take off again as this new audience begins to come in and sort of appreciate, this, say, celebrity in podcast form. To that, I also wanted to mention a little bit about downloads, and because you brought it up about, the publicist always wants to know how many downloads there are. And that's,
it's just funny because I don't believe the publicists and some of these people, the bigger kind of gets, understand that space.
They do,
and maybe they've been faked out enough that they get some giant celebrity that does a show with 9 followers and somehow we're convinced into it. So they need some backup to do it. So I understand it, but after 100 episodes, you'd think they would give you a shot or something.
Yeah, I feel for publicists because listen, every podcaster is going to want every guest on, but I've seen a couple of really neat things out there. First of all, anybody, whenever they say I have 50,000 downloads, well, that doesn't mean anything.
Sure.
What do you have in the last 30 days? What do you have in the last 90 days? How active is that podcast is really what you're looking for. So if a publicist is not asking like last 30 days, last 90 days, they're not asking for the right numbers. The next thing is, and I've got the Hot Air podcast, which is not a very big podcast. However, I wanted to have Megan Patrick, who's a country music superstar, on the show. And I presented it to them as, I'd like to interview Megan Patrick, but I don't want to talk too much about her music. I really just want to talk about why she's a fan of the Buffalo Bills.
Right.
And here I am with this audience of, Buffalo Bills fans who presumably would be listening, but I thought that was an interesting story. And she went for it. And, she did the interview. There's somebody else in my network, Xander, who's got Xander's podcast, 12 years old. And, I think Jimmy Kimmel. Yeah, Jimmy Kimmel was a guest. And for Jimmy, of course, is going to say, yes, I'm going to be interviewed by a 12-year-old. That's kind of a nice, fun, safe space that plays right in there. Sure. So I think as a podcaster, you have to offer something to anybody who's a celebrity. You got to make it worth their time. It's not good enough to just say, oh, I'm going to be, I want so-and-so on my podcast because I've got X amount of followers. Well, again, we talked about what's in it for the listener. Well, what's in it for your guest?
Yeah.
And I think
we get that a lot on the Kids on the Escalator. So the other pod that I do that people should or are familiar with or should be familiar with at least by this point is I have a show with my friend Chris called Kids on the Escalator podcast. So the standard radio kind of like interview about a new record or something or a new movie or whatever, there's like the publicist driven sort of same 10 questions. So that show is so focused on comic books and movies and film that when we have an artist on, Chris is such a expert of comic and film and whatever that once he asks are you a Batman or a Spider-Man person, it changes the whole thing. The whole thing is like, sure, we're going to talk about your record, but do you like Spider-Man or do you like Batman? And then it's like that. It's almost like, what kind of personality are you? And it changes the whole conversation. And then we always on that show get feedback from either the publicist or the artist saying, man, we haven't had those kind of interviews before. So that's exciting to do that. This show is probably more my show is probably more cookie cutter standard question stuff, but I certainly see what you're talking about offering that sort of like unique take on it. So you went through radio and then made it to a spot. And then were you let go or did you quit to move on? And were there other options from that side? Or you just decided to go all in on the podcasting because you made it in radio and now you're into podcasts. So where was that connection there?
Oh, I was let go from radio from that particular position, but I had offers to go back to other stations and work as a programmer in other capacities. And after taking a little time off, what I really began to see was that, do you want to work in radio and play in their rules, which I think we've already discussed, have changed and doesn't have the same connection level, or do you want to go and do the future? And I really think that podcasting is the future. And as a business, and I'm not saying that podcasting is here to take away from radio, because I don't think that's completely true. I think podcasting takes from all sorts of other media. But this I thought was expanding and growing and the future. And so I put my chips into that side of things. But I had some wonderful discussions with radio people about some dream jobs in 2016 and 2018 to work at some really, really nice radio stations. But inevitably, the decision was, I'm not going to do this, because if I spend 2 or 3 years doing that, I'll have missed growing my company, which I really began to sort of feel was onto something around 2018. And I think that moment happened somewhere in a yoga class when Marla Barr, who is she was affectionately known as the detox yogi, but started a podcast. She wanted to start a podcast called Your Wellness Journey. And I said, okay, let's see what we can do. And the more we talked, and we came up with a concept, and she became my first client. And then 1 became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8. And things began to really evolve from then. And then, when the pandemic hit and everybody wanted a podcast, that's when the company went from 12 to 30 very, very quickly. And
you got a lot on there. There's the Soundoff. I'm putting that logo up now. It's called the Soundoff Podcast Network. Matt's got his own show called the Soundoff Podcast. Predominantly, what does that show cover? The Soundoff Podcast.
So great question. We talk about, and if you go back and listen to episode 2 with Todd Hancock, and then you listen to 5, and then you listen to 30, the sound is really loud. It sounds like radio. It's a little obnoxious.
Yeah.
In presentation. I was trying some things with benchmarks, and in the end, the show really had to evolve into stories. And it's the stories of people who are in radio, sometimes podcast, sometimes voiceover. It's the people who would come into contact with my company. And so it is a branded podcast. I never meant for it to be one. In fact, when I started it, the company was called Matt Cundill Media and didn't become the Soundoff Podcast until 2 years into the podcast, at which point the company got named after the podcast, which is kind of interesting.
That's funny, because I've gone between like renaming Brenton On Tour and things, and that's just touching on your point earlier about not necessarily boredom, but creativity. So like I'm not no one knows me, so I've had to build it from the ground up, and I had a segments, coffee, music, travel, life, and my initial plan was to run through those 4 segments in 10 episode parts and then start over. So do 10 coffee, 10 music, 10 travel, 10 life, go back and program the audience to be expecting those. And then it kind of moved to a different direction as more guests and different kind of things came on. So it's interesting that you've even with your expertise and stuff had to had to make the adjustment, because I see that ahead going, maybe I have to adjust the name of this podcast. And I've gone back and forth. You and I have spoken about it in length. Should I, I was going to change the name of this show to just making it. But then I'm like, well, I've moved in this far, so I might as well just keep pushing it. So it doesn't seem to ever, that answer never seems to get answered.
and that's not only because your show has changed, but the landscape has changed. So 2018, Google showed up and said, okay, we're launching Google Podcasts. And then Google started to do this thing with whereby they started to identify websites that have a podcast. And so if your website was structured properly with episode pages and as well RSS feed being attached to it and a bunch of other things, it would begin to, so that if you just type in your name, oh, look, there's a podcast here. So now it's even offered in the search results of it. So, it's not just you. It's sort of the landscape around you that has really changed. And listen, it's exciting. Some mornings I wake up and I just find out that, oh, Amazon has decided to get podcasts. Well, now I've got something to do today. I've got to find a way to get 20 podcasts into Amazon Music by high noon today, email all the clients back and to say, listen, there's been this change in the business and, we've got you at the front of the line. Most people I know, who are sitting doing a podcast, they're like, did you know this about Amazon? I said, yeah, it happened 2 years ago. Listen, some people are still saying subscribe on iTunes. Well, iTunes was gone in 2018. Okay. And Apple even sent a note to podcasters saying, please don't say iTunes anymore. We are now Apple Podcasts.
Yeah.
And the subscribe button actually disappeared from our phones last April. It's now a follow button. You can subscribe on Google and you can follow on Spotify and Apple, but like a lot of people have not caught up with the vernacular, but it's not their fault. They don't know. Right.
Well, it constantly changes, as you said, because when I started on this. My first podcast was done on my phone in a hotel room in England. Okay. And then within probably a week of that, I was like, I got to get a mic, and then I got to get an interface, and then I was like trying to find ways to record on the road. And then just what's come along over the time, I was like, okay, I'd mastered this program, and then Zoom comes along and you're like, wow, we can do podcasts on Zoom. So then Zoom comes along, but then I'm like, I do all that, but then it changes because you can't really do graphics. And then Restream comes along, and then Restream makes it easier. And then you try to master Restream. And then you come along and say, you got to change this and change this. And I do that. And then we take, so for people listening at home, and I have that question about how to start a podcast, you record it, but then you've got to upload it into a program that'll send it out to iTunes. It'll send it out to Apple. It'll send it out to Spotify. It'll send it out to Google for you. And that's a process. Well, the whole Dean Blundell network, thanks to Matt, has switched over to a brand new system to do that. I thought I was really good on everything. It's completely messed me up, and I'm just catching up to it still and trying to, master that side of it. I feel like I can offer a little bit of pod advice, but then it changes every week. And you are the kind of guy that's staying on top of these trends and telling us now, no, you got to do this and you got to do that. And it's been such a big help. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. And especially like if you, like I'm working with, 30, 40, 50 podcasts right now. There's so many toys out there. Your progression, by the way, is very natural. It starts with a phone, a recording, an RSS feed. We get a microphone and an interface. This is a very natural progression.
Right.
But you don't need every toy in the box. And I think there's a little bit of FOMO with a lot of podcasters who feel that they do. I think one of the biggest changes in the last year has been video. And, I want to do a podcast. Where's my camera? And do I do video? I'm like, wait a second. That's two different ways to consume it. So we have to figure out what that is and how it's going to work best for you. I've been predominantly audio. And the reason why I got together with Dean Blundell at the Dean Blundell Network and everyone there is because a lot of people were asking for video and wanted some video strategies and offered up some solutions. But, at one point I was like, don't even bother with the still image and just putting the audio with the still image and putting it on YouTube. 2 years ago, I said no. And then 1 year ago, I'm like, still, do I have to? And then this year, I'm like, yeah, you gotta, because YouTube is now the number 2 search engine behind Google, and, they own each other. So, yes, you do have to have a video strategy, or at least you should consider one at some point. However, what is your work? I think when you start a podcast, workflow is so key. There's about, 11 steps that are involved to really making, a good podcast. But determine, am I going to be video first and then send it to audio, or am I going to do audio and then, do something else regarding video?
It's been weird because I go, well, just to give the listener, breakdown of that side of it. But I was all audio first, and then we added video, and slowly I had to figure out that. Then I had to figure out how to do it properly on Twitter. Then I had to find out the proper editing thing. It's a lot of work, people, just so you know. And then as an independent, especially if I don't have a team behind me, some of those successful pods are a benefit of having a team. And it's like the second you get off the air, you don't do anything. The team takes over and makes it a thing, which is fantastic. I don't have that, so it's me. Chris and I on Kids on the Escalator, we get a lot of views, but listens are still a struggle because people want to watch our show because we're talking about comic books and film. My show gets a lot of audio over views. Something like Talking Sopranos, which I love, I'm all audio on that because I'm visioning. They're breaking that show, that Sopranos down scene by scene. So me as a fan, I'm listening to that show and envisioning the scene. I actually don't want to watch Steve and Michael Imperioli on a screen talking to each other. I want to listen and have them take me there. And so that pod's completely a different way of consuming it. So I guess it really boils down to what you're talking about, which is you got to define what it is that you're doing.
Yeah. And as a creator, I'm a be everywhere guy. I know everyone's like, well, I just want this on Spotify and I'm done. Like, well, no, and you're not going to believe this. Somebody was actually once cutting my hair. But when they were cutting my hair, I think they said they liked, I think it was Dax Shepard. Do you listen to podcasts? It says, yes, Dax Shepard. I said, well, how do you listen to that? Go, well, on YouTube. I said, well, you mean you watch it on YouTube? Yeah, I guess I put it on in the back and I listen. I go, but why wouldn't you just put it on Spotify? And I didn't find myself arguing with the person, but I wanted to know why. But the truth of the matter is they will consume it the way they want to consume it.
Mm-hmm.
Our job is really as podcasters, just can we make it available to them in some capacity? Because they're going to watch it the way they want.
Sure.
They're going to do it the way they want to do it. I listen to some shows on multiple apps. I think we were talking about sports earlier. I listen to the Colin Cowherd show every night at 10 o'clock. I download it and I listen to it. But I'll download it on Spotify so I can put it on my smart speaker device. I don't want to say the name of her because everybody's machine will ring out and that's annoying. But
right.
But that's the only reason. But if I'm in the car, I'll listen on Apple. So there's multiple ways to listen to things.
So now that you've gone through radio and you've built this great podcast network, I got a 2-part question for you, and then I'll let you roll. So have your goals changed now that you've got through radio and you've started this network? And what's your new definition of making it?
That's a great question because I feel like I'm kind of just at the lynch point of what I envisioned when I started, which was having created a podcast network. And we did get this far into this and not even talk about the values of dynamic ad insertion, which is where the ads go. You can target the ads into certain parts of your podcast and as well monetize some of the older episodes in your podcast stream.
Mm-hmm.
So I really fell in love with dynamic ad insertion around 2018 and really sort of found the value of being able to have an ad that will run only in Canada, and then you can resell the spot in the United States. And listen, if I went on too much about it, technically I would probably bore the audience. But I guess there is, for 2022, the pandemic really did speed things up and change things, not only for me and for, clients showing up, but it also changed it for, companies like Restream and Squadcast and everybody who put toys out there. And there's an influx of Zoom. I'm still a firm believer. Do not use Zoom for your podcast. It sounds awful. I don't know what it's like when I can't define what it sounds like to listen to a podcast that's been recorded by Zoom, but I can identify it when I hear it, much the same way I can with identify porn. But again, there's so many toys out there, going on, and the future is now that we built this up. A lot of it is, hey, let's build a fire and let's throw some crud on it and see where it goes. So making it for me has always been sort of growth year over year, but not hockey stick growth. And I think that's the big lesson, whether it's for my company and maybe I'll judge it financially, maybe I'll judge it by, revenue or number of listeners or number of clients I have, but it's the same for downloads. Did it grow? that's all, even if it grew just a little bit, that's okay. 1, 2, 3%.
Yeah.
And I got out, I do a podcast and then once a week, and then I would check the downloads, and I'm checking every night before bed, and it makes me crazy. And why didn't it go up? And, look at it in terms of 30 days and 90 days. That's the only thing you need to do. Good metrics, 30 days and 90 days. Did it grow 1, 2, 3%? That's great. And so Valerie Geller, who is, really behind 3 years to build an audience. I said to her in a podcast episode, a very good one, if you want to get some free coaching and advice for audio. I said, Valerie, it's a lot like breaking rocks all day to have to do this, to do the social media posting and to market and to create an audiogram and make appearances on the internet to tell people where to find it and stuff. And she's like, well, is it breaking rocks or is it building blocks? And it's building blocks, and it's slow and it takes time. And, thankfully I've got a partner, my partner Avery. She's just, says, do you remember that time in 2015 when you were like, didn't have any of this stuff and really didn't know where it was going, and your company had revenues of $10,000 and $15,000 a year? And I'm like, yeah. And that wasn't even podcast money. That was like consulting money and some other crazy stuff. So, look how far you've come. And it's a slow process. And did it grow? And are you happy with the growth? And that's it. Don't go looking for any hockey stick growth. If you're thinking your podcast is going to start bringing millions of people and money in, it's not. It's a slow process.
It is certainly
building blocks.
It's a building block. Final question for you: has Matt Cundill made it?
He has. He's done very well for himself. I'm actually. Thank you. And again, I'm 25. 7 years. 7 years is, I think, in whatever it is that you do, 7 years, there's something to it. So I sort of looked at 7 years being on a radio show. That's a lap around the track in terms of like listeners and a generation of listeners. Yeah. If you get a second lap around the track, that's 2 generations, because I know some radio shows have gone 14 years. After 7 years, you've done a pretty significant, some changes may need to happen in some capacity. That's that 7-year itch. It's not just for relationships.
Sure.
It can be for so many things. I mean, you have a relationship with your work or your career and whatever it is that you're doing. So, I mean, look at it that way. I mean, I think there is something coming next for me in terms, and I think, having launched again, a second network with Dean Blundell and partnering up and doing all that, we're building something over with Spotify on Megaphone and looking to the future with that, with content creators. I think this is really, really exciting. And we're doing it in Canada as well, with a lot of, and I know that a lot of people are like, well, what does that mean? Well, Canada is 1/10 the United States.
Yeah.
And I think I think if you want to have like a big podcast, you're going to need some American downloads. So I'm not sure that talking about the Winnipeg Jets is going to make you a top podcast in North America. In that sense, maybe if you're the Packers or the Lakers or the Cowboys, and you can talk about it and do well, you'll probably get some American downloads. But it's very, very hard to get some all those downloads and attract the attention of advertisers. If you're going to be talking about something on the smaller side, there's nothing wrong with doing a podcast about the Winnipeg Jets. You're just going to have to sort of know your audience in that playground that
well, it sets your goals. It's like you're probably only defined into that. But I've always I talked to Mercedes about it too, and when we were first coming out and a lot of the research that I did, and I'll just kind of ended up with this point, but there's so many different ways to kind of set out goals. But if she can have the #1 podcast in Whistler, then that's fine too. There's tons of advertising money in Whistler. There's tons of ways to make a living with a podcast in Whistler. Shaw Cable just picked her up and threw her on. So good for her. Like, it's one of those things where they recognize what she's doing and did it. So I'm really, really happy for that. And I think that, if you look at having the biggest podcast in the world, great. If you look at having the biggest podcast in your little town, then take all the advertising out of that little town and have the biggest podcast in Winnipeg. Whatever is going to be for you, but as long as you're doing it to be creative and entertain yourself, you should be able to entertain everybody else. And nobody does it better than you, my friend. And I appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks. I mean, it's so true. It's not about having the biggest audience. It's about having, the right audience.
Dedicated. Okay. Where can everybody find you online and all the good stuff, my friend?
You can see all the podcasts are over at soundoff.network. And my podcast is called the Soundoff Podcast, and you can find that anywhere podcasts are available. Although I'm not supposed to say that because it's a bit of a trap word, because if somebody wants to go to Facebook, there's not exactly the podcast there. But
listen, and you've got some great stuff on your Soundoff podcast show. Anybody that's interested in starting a podcast or going down that road, Matt interviews tons of people that can help you with that process. And you never know, maybe you'll build something and get added to his network one day. But that's Matt Cundill, Soundoff Podcast and Soundoff Podcast Network. Also part of the Dean Blundell Network, a good buddy of ours, a big help to all of us. And I thank you on behalf of everybody on the network and all the work that you do for us and helping us grow this thing together. It's been awesome. So,
well, thanks for having me today.
No problem, buddy. That is the Brenton On Tour Podcast for another week. Join me next week. The more people that are making it, their definition of making it, what's theirs, what's yours, whatever it is, friends, do it your way. So that's it for this week. Thanks, everybody.